First of all, I want to remind everybody, if you haven't already purchased a copy of my recent book, my latest book, The Real Crash, America's Coming Bankruptcy, How to Save Yourself and Your Future, and Your Country, rather. You can pick it up at audiblepodcast.com. You can actually get it for free. They're giving away a first audiobook for free, so you might as well make it mine. audiblepodcast.com/Schiff. Don't forget the /Schiff. If you've already gotten your free book, remember they've got over 100,000 audio titles to choose from, including all of my books and many other worthwhile books. So make sure and check them out. Joining the program now is Richard Wolff. Richard is a visiting professor in the graduate program of international affairs for the New School University in New York City, where he teaches a regular class, Brent Forum in Manhattan. He's also the host of Economic Update. He's the author of Democracy at Work, A Cure for Capitalism. Richard, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Peter, for inviting me.
Sure. Now, I guess by saying a cure for capitalism, obviously that implies that capitalism is some kind of disease and that you've got the remedy. Unfortunately, I think the disease is government's interference in capitalism, and that's what needs to be cured. I think that capitalism is very healthy until government infects it and poisons it. But anyway, you're blaming capitalism for the problems both in America and in Europe. So specifically, what about capitalism do you think is responsible for the plight on either side of the Atlantic? I guess you could take your pick.
Okay. Let me first say that we may not be in as much disagreement as you might imagine. The last thing I want to do is to excuse or to relieve the government of the United States, for that matter, or of England or any place else, from the enormous responsibilities it had and has for the crisis we're in, for the way the system works, and so on. So no way am I thinking of them as the solution or as the bystander or mere witness. They are involved. At the same time, I think it is incumbent on all of us to ask questions about how and why governments intervene in the disastrous ways that they do, and likewise in all the disastrous ways that they don't, in the ways that capitalism functions. So I think.
But more specifically, let's look at the United States. We are in a pretty bad. We have a weak economy right now. I think it's a depression. You could say it's a recession.
I agree.
We had a financial crisis, a housing bubble. How is capitalism responsible for that?
Well, let me give you an example, and it'll touch on today's headlines. One of the central reasons that we had a breakdown of our economic system and the beginnings of what I agree with you is a depression back in 2007, 2008, was we had an economic system which had raised the wages of American workers literally for 100 years before the 1970s. Because we had a labor shortage in this country, because we needed to bring waves of immigrants here to solve that labor shortage, we had an extraordinarily successful capitalism that raised the wages of people decade after decade for 100 years. No other capitalism.
And I would add, I would add that the principal reason that American wages went up was because of the investment in plant and equipment that raised the productivity of American workers.
Absolutely.
And so it was the ability of Americans to utilize the tools of capitalism that made them productive and enabled their wages to rise.
Agreed. Could not agree more. The rate of productivity rose even faster than the rate of real wages rose, which was one of those wonderful win-win situations that systems sometimes can generate, in which profits went up even faster than wages. Because of that productivity, capitalists could and did reinvest much of their profits, and they were able to find the immigrants and others to work for them, paying them a rising wage. It was a wonderful system. But the problem with capitalism can be encapsulated as follows. After 100 years of doing that and doing it successfully and producing a United States capitalism that literally outshone the capitalisms anywhere else, you had created by those rising wages a new situation. And in the 1970s, we saw how capitalism reacts to that situation. Number one, an important new technical breakthrough, the computer, that replaces large numbers of people with a much cheaper machine. The export of all kinds of jobs from the United States. First, manufacturing.
Well, but let me stop you for a second.
Okay.
How is the computer any different than any other labor-saving device, any other automated device? When we invented, a bulldozer, that took the place of hundreds of men with shovels. I mean, the whole idea, it wasn't until computers that we started to supplant labor with technology. Labor-saving devices are the key to rising productivity. So why didn't the advent of the computer simply work the similar magic to increase productivity and lead to higher real wages?
Because of the confluence of other events that happened simultaneously that hadn't happened simultaneously when you invented the steam engine or you invented modern chemistry.
Okay, what are those events? What are those events? Okay, go ahead.
Number one, because of the high wages in the United States, capitalists had an incentive to move out of the country. At the same time that we replaced workers with machines, computers here in the United States, starting big time in the 1970s, we also simultaneously start a big time movement of jobs out of this country away to all the places who hadn't experienced the rising wages, so that they offered workers who could do roughly the same but with a lot less pay. Number three, we transformed the American family for a whole host of reasons that led to millions and millions of women leaving the home for paid work, looking for work in ways that they had not done for a long time. And finally, we had a new surge of immigration into the country, not from Europe this time, but from Latin America, mainly Central America. And so we had a classic economic situation. Computers plus the movement of jobs abroad lowers the demand for labor, and women and immigrants coming into the labor force in huge numbers, increasing the supply of labor, and the outcome was very predictable. The end of rising wages. The real wage in the United States today is what it was in the late 70s. And
I think let me stop you for a minute. First of all, when it comes to cheaper labor abroad, look, there was cheaper labor abroad in the 1950s by far, and yet we weren't outsourcing. And there are countries today that have higher wage scales than America that are not outsourcing their jobs, that still have trade surpluses. You have some of the biggest countries with surpluses like Japan and Germany have higher wage scales than America, yet it hasn't stopped. I think you have to look at other factors such as the government, the taxes, and the regulations that are driving this. And you have to look at the monetary policy where the dollar is acting as the reserve currency. And so normally a country that was doing what America was doing would experience a big drop in its currency, and it wouldn't be able to export those jobs because its purchasing power would fall. But because all these foreign central banks are intervening in the market and propping up the U.S. dollar, we can sustain these large deficits that in a free market, in a capitalist market, would not have been possible. But to call that capitalism when you have all this central bank manipulation, it's hardly capitalism. When it comes to women in the labor force, we should benefit from all that work. If women are now working, that's more production, that's more labor that should be lifting everybody's standard of living to the fact that women are there. And the same thing with immigrants. If we have more people coming into the economy, even if you're saying that helps drive wages down, then it drives prices down. And the biggest beneficiaries of low prices are the wage earners, are the common man. And so I don't see...
If that worked that way, you wouldn't have the statistics that everyone left, right, and center understands to be happening, which is a widening in the gap of inequality of income and even more of wealth here in the United States. It didn't have those results. And you also have to ask, as we did at the beginning of this interview, why do central banks around the world put their manipulations and their money in the dollar? The answer is that capitalists around the world have decided, for all kinds of reasons, to flood the United States with their money. It is a safer place for them. It is more secure for them. And then again, it has the necessary results on maintaining the dollar.
But I wouldn't call that capitalism. When you have government cooperating with business, that's more of a fascist model where you have governments propping up the dollar so certain companies can sell products to people who can't really afford to buy them. I mean, that kind of manipulation isn't capitalism. It's in the period that you're talking to, when we were on a gold standard and we had real money, that was capitalism, and it worked. But now we have this crony capitalism. I think what your problem is, it's not that capitalism is failing, it's that crony capitalism. If we still had capitalism, if we had sound money, if we didn't have these central banks manipulating, if we didn't have the government so involved in subsidizing the economy, in guaranteeing loans, guaranteeing bank deposits, guaranteeing mortgages, all the ways that it micromanages the economy from Washington, if it wasn't guaranteeing student loans and subsidizing health care, if we actually had capitalism, you wouldn't be exerting any of these problems. We would still have a rising standard of living. We would still have rising real wages. What changed wasn't that capitalism failed, but that we failed to keep the capitalism we had.
But even if you were right, Peter, you'd have to explain why that happened, why capitalism keeps producing as its own history evolves one governmental intervention after another, why the government interventions are justified, rationalized, and executed by people temporarily on loan from the capitalist system, to which they return after their stint as a government.
That's an excellent point, and that's what we're going to discuss when you get back, because it's not really capitalism that fails, it's democracy. Democracy is the problem, not capitalism, because democracy undermines capitalism. Our founding fathers knew that. That's why they set us up as a republic. Unfortunately, we could not keep the republic. As Benjamin Franklin feared, he gave us a republic, but we could not keep it. And it's a democracy that has undermined capitalism both in America and in Europe. We'll talk about that when we get back, so don't go away. This is Peter Schiff, and we're talking capitalism with Richard Wolff, although I think we're to change the subject from capitalism to democracy, because, Rich, you make a good point. You're saying, why does capitalism have a tendency to almost self-destruct, to sow the seeds of its own destruction? But it's not capitalism that's self-destructing, it's democracy. The problem is politicians want to get votes, and they buy them by promising voters something from nothing. And that's what screws up capitalism. It's government interference. And this is something that has been going on for a long, long time. And it's very unfortunate that we have not been able to control a democracy. And instead, it has been able to do so much damage to what would have otherwise been a very prosperous capitalist societies.
Well, I'm struck, Peter, and again, I'm struck by our degree of agreement, and maybe there's some deeper reason or wisdom about that. But I agree with you that there is a very difficult, awkward, uncomfortable relationship between capitalism on the one hand and democracy on the other, although I would guess that we would come at that from a different perspective. But let me comment on politicians that are looking for votes and acting accordingly. I agree with you. I think that's part of how our system works and produces some very bizarre results. But I'm even more impressed by that other thing that our politicians are being forced more and more in modern times to look for, and that isn't the votes so much as it is the money that they see as necessary to ever get those votes. We now have, whether it's Citizens United or any of the other recent decisions, coming on top of a growing tendency that election in our democracy requires enormous amounts of money. Those are not going to be gathered by $10 and $15 contributions from average men and women. And so our politicians are going to, guess what, some of our larger capitalists, and asking them for the money, which they get, and which we all understand is not given without a good understanding of quid pro quo that is to come from it. And so we see the peculiar chaos when politicians in debt to particular capitalists take steps that it may be good for them in particular, but may cost the larger capitalist system in ways that are much
right.
Much
and
more
I think we need a new word, though. I would say that a business that makes a contribution to a politician in exchange for a favor is not a capitalist, because under capitalism, there are no favors doled out by government. That is the problem. So when you have a business that is able to extract rents,
you're right, Peter,
it's not capitalism.
You and I both know that there are precious few capitalists around who are going to walk away from a situation in which a relatively, for them, small contribution to a politician or two that could solve a basic problem they have is something they're going to not do on the basis of some abstract principle.
Well, that's just human nature.
We're watching the headlines, you and I, of the LIBOR scandal in England, in which a handful of bankers were basically willing and able to play around with the interest rates everybody lives by in order to improve the
problem, Richard, that's human nature. Once you've endowed the government with this power to dole out special privileges to some, and in fact, in many cases, the government is kind of like the mafia, because it's almost, if you don't pay, then they're going to go after you. Because if you don't give money to the politicians, your competitor will, and then the club of government will be used on you. So it's almost like you have no choice but to play this game. But the problem is that we've given all this power to government, and that's not capitalism. So if you have a problem with this system, you don't have a problem with capitalism. Actually, you're advocating for capitalism when you're criticizing what we got now.
Well, I would say that if there were, in my head, and if you could persuade me that there was a reasonable prospect in the United States or any other major capitalist country of the end of a long, and I'm talking hundreds of years, 200 years at least, prospect and process in which governments have become stronger and stronger, and the politicians who made them stronger were gathering into their hands the contributions from those same capitalists whose positions they were reinforcing, then I would maybe see some way of being allied with you in this criticism. But I don't.
Well, I think this whole these systems
as a system to build up the very government, which then can undo it. And I see that contradiction.
But these governments, Richard, these governments are going to collapse. Countries, Europe, United States, these social welfare states are imploding on their own debt, and so something is going to change. We're at this fork of the road, and we're either going to go back to capitalism or we're going to go all the way to totalitarianism. But what would be your solution, given that we both agree that the system right now is not working? My solution is try to go back to capitalism and get rid of all this government. I mean, what's your solution?
My solution, again, has a certain affinity with yours, but I don't see it as being a reversing history. I don't think we have that in our power, much as we might like to. So my idea is we ought to change the way businesses work, the internal organization of businesses. And what I mean by that is to make them much more like what we used to call cooperatives, businesses in which the workers who do the work collectively work out what they want to happen, so that we don't get a few people with billions in their pockets and everybody else, worried about.
But there's nothing that stops that from happening. I mean, that's not something that has to be ordered from the top down. But my experience as an employer is most employees don't want that. They don't want to share in the risks of a business. They want the stability of a paycheck. They don't want to have to worry if they're going to make money at the end of the week or the end of the month. They don't want to be an entrepreneur. They don't want to be a businessman. They want a reliable paycheck that they can count on. But if workers want to get together with a boss and pool all the risk and decide to subordinate their paychecks to the other expenditures of the business and get a piece of the upside in exchange for a piece of the downside, nobody stops them from doing that. We don't need anybody to order that. But my experience is that's not the way it's going to work. People are not going to organize themselves that way.
I think you were right up to about 5 years ago. I think what's happening in the United States, based on my speaking around the country and all the rest, is this. that the delivery of a secure paycheck is ancient history for more and more Americans. They've either lost their job or they've lost any sense of the security.
It's not because they don't want one. It's not because they don't want that paycheck. It's because they can't get it.
That's right. I agree with you. They want it. They can't get it. And they are now asking questions of the sort you're raising, much more fundamental, the kinds that we're discussing. And I think they're now ready to understand that in order to be secure, they have to participate in the risk-taking, in the running of the enterprise, and that's their surest bet to get out of a situation that looks very dire, not only in terms of the situation now.
We're running out of time here, but Richard, the key is, though, if we got to get the government out of the way either way, because if businesses are having a hard time succeeding, and which means their employees are going to have just as hard a time if they decide, to go in on them and assume the risks of business. But hey, I thought we were going to get a lot more debate. Instead, we had more agreement and disagreement. So you're not really a socialist. You're a closet capitalist. Richard, thanks for coming on. We got another hour coming up on a Peter Schiff show, so don't go away.